There is a kind of storm that does not give you a warning. In the hill country around Galilee, the dry season can stretch on for months without a single drop of rain. The ground cracks, riverbeds turn to dust and stone, and children play in valleys that look like they have never seen water in their lives. People build there because the land is flat and the digging is easy. It takes half the time. It takes half the effort. Then winter comes, and with it, a storm that rolls in off the sea so fast that a man can be standing in sunlight 1 hour and standing in a flood the next. Those dry valleys fill in minutes, not hours. The water comes down from the hills with a force that does not ask permission and does not wait for anyone to get ready. 2 men built 2 houses. One looked at the valley floor, saw how easy the digging was, and built his home right there, foundation resting on nothing but sand. The other walked further, up toward higher ground, where the earth was hard and the digging took weeks longer, sweat and blisters, and a back that ached every night, until he hit solid rock and built on that instead. For a while, you could not tell the difference between the 2 houses. Same kind of walls, same kind of roof. From the outside, both looked finished, both looked safe. Then the rain came. It was not the rain itself that destroyed the first house. It was what the rain revealed. The water rose, and the same wind beat against both homes at once. No favoritism in the weather, and the house on the sand did not bend or lean or struggle for a while before it gave up. It collapsed, completely, all at once, because there had never been anything underneath it to hold on to in the first place. The house on the rock stood. Jesus told this story near the end of one of his longest teachings, and he did not tell it as a nice closing illustration. He told it as a warning wrapped inside a promise. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. Both houses faced the exact same storm. That is the part most people miss. The storm was not the test. The storm was the reveal. So here is the question this is really about, and I want you to sit with it for a second before we go any further. It is not, will hard things happen to you? They will. Jesus never once promised otherwise. The question is, what was already true about your life before the hard thing arrived? The part nobody could see. The part that only gets exposed once the water starts to rise. There is a secret hidden in plain sight inside the teachings of Jesus about what it actually takes to remain standing when everything around you is shaking. It was never about avoiding the storm. People have spent 2,000 years trying to bargain their way out of pain, out of loss, out of fear, and it has never once worked. Not for anyone, not even for the people who loved God the most. The secret was never about the absence of the storm. It was about what gets built before it ever shows up. And the first person who ever learned that lesson learned it the hard way, with his feet on water that should not have been able to hold him at all. If this is the kind of question your soul has been circling for a while now, stay with me. And if you would like to keep walking through the words of Jesus with us like this, every week, you are welcome to subscribe along the way. For now, write this in the comments. Lord, show me what I am building on. Type it even if you are not sure. You are ready to hear the answer. Let us begin on the water, where one disciple found out that standing firm does not always look like standing still. It was already late when the wind changed. The Sea of Galilee is not really a sea. It is a lake, large enough to lose sight of the shore in the middle of it, but small enough that the surrounding hills wrap around it on almost every side. And those hills do something dangerous. Cool air drops down through the mountain, passes in the evening, and slams into the warm air sitting over the water. And a storm can rise on Galilee in the space of 20 minutes with almost no warning at all. Fishermen who had worked that lake their whole lives feared it more than almost anything else they faced. The disciples were out on the water that night because Jesus had sent them ahead while he stayed behind to pray alone. He had just finished feeding a crowd of thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And the people had been so amazed that some of them wanted to grab him and crown him king right there on the spot. Jesus slipped away from all of it. He sent his disciples out onto the lake and went up the mountain by himself to pray. And he stayed there long after the sun went down, by the 4th watch of the night, somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. The wind had turned the lake into chaos. The boat was being thrown around, and men who knew this water better than they knew their own homes were rowing for their lives and getting nowhere. That is when they saw him, a figure walking toward them, on top of the water, moving through the wind like the wind was not even there. The grown men in that boat, hardened fishermen, started screaming, because the only thing that made sense to them in that moment was that they were looking at a ghost. "Take heart," Jesus called out across the wind. "It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter was the one who answered, not the friend beside him, not the one rowing across from him. Peter, the same man who would later deny knowing Jesus 3 times in one night. The same man Jesus would still choose to build his church on. He called back through the storm, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said one word back, "Come." Peter climbed over the side of the boat. His feet hit the surface, and for a handful of steps, it held him. He was actually walking on the same lake that had nearly capsized the boat he just climbed out of, in the middle of a wind strong enough to terrify experienced sailors. Then he looked at the waves. The moment his eyes left Jesus and landed on the size of what was happening around him, he started to sink. Scripture does not soften this part. It says he began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. I want you to notice what did not happen in that story. Jesus did not stand there and let Peter drown to teach him a lesson about doubt. He did not wait to see how serious Peter was before deciding whether to help. There was no delay between the cry for help and the hand that reached out. This is where most people get the story backwards. We tell it like it is a story about Peter's failure, about how he should have had more faith, about how he took his eyes off Jesus and that is why he sank. And there is truth in that. Jesus does ask him, gently, "Why did you doubt?" But look at who stayed exactly where they were. The rest of the men in that boat never got out at all. They stayed safe, dry, and steady, and never once experienced what Peter experienced, because Peter was the only one who asked to come. Being steadfast was never about Peter's ability to walk on water without ever looking down. If that were the standard, no one reading the words on this screen right now would qualify either. being steadfast, looked like a man who got out of the boat in the first place, who sank in front of everyone, and who knew exactly who to cry out to when the water closed in over his head. There is a kind of stillness that looks impressive from a distance and means nothing, because it never costs anything. The men in the boat looked calm. They never sank. They also never walked. And there is a kind of faith that looks like failure in the moment. The kind that gets your feet wet. The kind other people might even laugh at. That is actually the only kind that ever puts you close enough to the hand that can catch you. Maybe you are in a season right now where you feel like you are sinking. Maybe you said yes to something God called you toward. A marriage, a calling, a hard conversation, a step of obedience that looked impossible from where you were standing. And now the wind has picked up and you are starting to go under. I want you to hear this clearly. Sinking is not proof that you misheard God. Sinking is not evidence that you should have stayed in the boat. The storm on Galilee did not appear because Peter made a mistake. The storm was already there. It was already raging before he ever climbed over the side of that boat. The wind did not start because of his faith or stop because of his fear. It was simply the condition he stepped out into. The same condition every person reading this is going to step out into eventually, whether they choose to or not. The only real question that night was not whether the storm would come. It was already there. The question was who Peter would call out to once it got too big to handle on his own. That is the first secret hidden inside what it means to stand firm. It does not begin with strength. It begins with a cry that already knows exactly where to go. Peter was not the only man in that part of the world learning the hard way what it actually meant to stand firm. There was a fortress on the eastern side of the Dead Sea called Machaerus, built high on a ridge with a view stretching for miles in every direction. The kind of place a king builds when he wants everyone below him to remember exactly who holds the power. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, this is where the story took place that the Gospels tell about a cousin of Jesus named John, a man who had spent years out in the wilderness, eating locusts and wild honey, calling people to repentance at the edge of a river. Herod Antipas ruled that region under Rome's authority, and he kept John locked in a dungeon beneath that same fortress. For one reason, John had told him, plainly, that it was not right for him to have taken his brother's wife as his own. He said it knowing exactly what it could cost him. And here is the part of the story most people skip past too quickly. Herod did not have John killed the moment those words left his mouth. Mark's Gospel says Herod liked to listen to him, even feared him a little, even protected him for a while from his own wife's anger. There was something in John that Herod could not look away from, even while everything in Herod's life was built to resist it. It was Herod's pride, not his power, that finally killed John. At a party, in front of his guests, he made a careless promise to a young woman who danced for him, the daughter of the very wife John had confronted him about. When she asked, at her mother's urging, for John's head on a platter, Herod was too embarrassed in front of his guests to take the promise back. A man with an entire army at his command killed an innocent man because he could not stand the thought of looking weak at his own dinner table. Ask yourself, who was actually strong in that fortress? Herod had every tool the world calls power, and none of it helped him do the one thing that mattered, which was to simply live by the truth he already half believed. He was a slave to his own image, in front of people who would forget his party within the year. John had none of that power. And there is something worth saying honestly here too. John was not flawless either. Later, sitting alone in that same dark cell, with no idea how much longer he had left, he sent word to Jesus, asking a question that sounds almost nothing like the bold preacher who once confronted a king without blinking. Are you the one we have been waiting for? Or should we keep looking for someone else? Even John, locked in the dark with time to think, had a moment where the waiting and the uncertainty got to him. That detail matters more than people realize. It means the strength we are talking about here was never about a man who never doubted, never wavered, never wondered if he had gotten it all wrong. It means strength held on even through a question like that one. In a cell, with no answer yet in sight. This is the strength Jesus described when he opened his most famous teaching, on a hillside overlooking that same lake, where Peter would later sink and be caught. He did not open it by praising the kind of strength Herod had. He opened it by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart." The word used for meek in that passage had a very specific meaning in the world Jesus was speaking into. It was the word used for a wild horse that had been broken and trained. Not a horse that had lost its strength, but a horse whose full strength was now being directed with purpose instead of running wild and dangerous. The power was still entirely there. It had simply stopped being its own master. That is almost the opposite of what most of us are taught to admire. We are taught to admire people who never back down, who control every room they walk into, who never let anyone see them struggle. Jesus stood on that hillside and told an entire crowd that the people the world overlooks, the grieving, the gentle, the merciful, the ones who ache for things to be made right, are the ones who are actually blessed, actually strong in the way that matters once everything else gets stripped away. Herod kept his throne a while longer. History does not remember him as strong. It remembers a man so afraid of looking weak in front of his own guests that he murdered someone he respected rather than risk a little embarrassment. John lost his head in that fortress. Doubts and all. And that is somehow not the part of his story anyone remembers either. What people remember is a voice that, even with a question hanging in the dark, never fully stopped trusting the one he had asked it to. The house on the rock was never about looking impressive while the sun was shining. It was about what remains standing once the wind finds out what you are actually made of. Doubts and all. There was a farmer outside a small village in Galilee who spent 6 weeks digging before he ever laid a single stone. His neighbor finished his house in 8 days. Flat ground, soft dirt, a foundation barely deep enough to hold a chair, let alone a home, by the time the farmer was still down in his trench, sweating through another afternoon, breaking tools on rock he could not even see yet. His neighbor was already hosting friends for the housewarming, laughing about how some people overthink everything. Nobody throws a party for a man who is still digging. That is the part of building on rock nobody puts in the inspiring version of the story. It is slow. It is invisible. It does not look like progress to anyone standing outside watching. The man who finished in 8 days had something to show immediately. Walls people could admire. A roof people could compliment. The man who was still digging had nothing to show anyone except dirt, blisters, and a hole in the ground that did not look like a house at all yet. This is exactly the kind of life Jesus describes right before he ever mentions the storm. Most people remember the parable of the two houses as the closing illustration of the Sermon on the Mount. They forget what Jesus said right before it. Instruction about what to actually build, in secret, long before anyone is watching. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. 3 times in the same teaching, Jesus uses the word secret, and he is not talking about hiding something shameful. He is talking about a kind of strength formed in a place nobody else can see, on a day nobody else will remember, through a choice nobody else will ever know you made. Think about what that means for forgiveness. Bitterness does not show up the moment someone hurts you. It shows up later, quietly, in the small decision to keep replaying what they said, to keep the account open instead of closing it. Nobody sees that choice happen. There is no audience for the moment a person decides to let go of something they had every right to hold on to. But that choice, repeated over months and years, becomes the difference between a person who can survive betrayal and a person who is destroyed by it the moment it actually comes. Think about what it means for prayer. The crowd that watched Jesus feed 5,000 people never saw him slip away afterward to pray alone on a mountain for hours in the dark, long after everyone else had gone home or fallen asleep. That prayer life did not produce a miracle anyone could point to. It produced something nobody could see at all, until a night in a garden called Gethsemane, when everything he had built in private was the only thing standing between him and despair. There is a kind of person who only prays when they need something. There is another kind who has been talking to God so long, in rooms with the door shut, that when the real crisis finally arrives, they are not starting that relationship from scratch. They are simply continuing a conversation that has been going on for years. The farmer digging his foundation could not see the storm that was still months away. He had no idea exactly when the rain would come or how bad it would be. He just knew that the ground beneath him needed to be solid before anything else mattered, even if that meant looking foolish in front of a neighbor who finished first. We tend to imagine that the moment of crisis is when our character gets built. It is not. The moment of crisis is when our character gets revealed. What shows up in the flood was already decided in the digging. I want to be honest about something here, because this part matters. Most people are not going to feel inspired while they are doing the quiet work. Forgiving someone for the 5th time when they have not even apologized does not feel like victory. Praying alone in a room with nobody watching, when you are not even sure anyone is listening, does not feel like progress. Choosing honesty in a small moment when a small lie would be so much easier does not feel like it is building anything at all. It rarely does. In the moment, the farmer probably did not feel inspired either. 6 weeks in, watching his neighbor's party from a distance, but the ground does not ask how you felt while you were digging. It only asks whether you reached rock before the rain came. It was springtime on the hillside above the lake. and wildflowers had taken over the entire slope. This was not a metaphor Jesus had to reach for in his imagination. These were the kind of flowers that covered the Galilean countryside for a few short weeks each year. Brilliant red and purple. Fields that would be brown and forgotten by summer. Nobody planted them. Nobody watered them or stood guard over them at night. They simply grew, bloomed for a season, and faded. And the next year they did it again, without anyone's help at all. While Jesus was teaching, birds were almost certainly moving across the sky, above the crowd. The same kind that nested in the cliffs around that lake. They had no barns, no storage houses, no harvest sitting in reserve for winter. And the Father who made them was still, every single day, the one feeding them. Look at the birds of the air, Jesus said, pointing at something the entire crowd could actually see right in front of them. They do not sow or reap or gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon, in all his splendor, was not dressed like one of these. Solomon had been the wealthiest king in the history of Israel, a man whose wealth and riches are described across pages of Scripture in almost staggering detail. And Jesus is standing on a hillside telling an audience of farmers and fishermen that a wildflower they were about to walk past without noticing was dressed more beautifully than the richest king who ever lived. And that flower would be dead and gone within the month. Then comes the line that lands the hardest. Because it is the line that everyone listening that day, and everyone listening now, actually needed to hear. Therefore do not be anxious, saying, "What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear?" Your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. I do not think Jesus is telling people not to care about food or money or clothing. He fed thousands of people with his own hands more than once. What he is confronting is something underneath the worry, the assumption that we are the ones responsible for holding the whole future together with our own grip, that if we let go for even a moment, everything collapses. There is a story Jesus told about a farmer whose land produced more than he knew what to do with. Instead of being grateful, his first instinct was anxiety, dressed up as ambition. He decided to tear down his barns and build bigger ones, so he could finally relax once everything was secured. That same night, his life ended. He never got to enjoy a single harvest from the barns he was building to protect a future that was never actually his to control in the first place. That story is not really about wealth. It is about the lie that says peace will arrive once we have stored up enough, controlled enough, secured enough, that we will finally be able to stop being afraid once the conditions are perfect. The man with the barns believed that lie completely, and it cost him everything he thought he was building toward. Here is what I want to say plainly. Because faith is sometimes presented as something that should erase anxiety entirely. And when it does not, people quietly assume something is wrong with them. Jesus does not promise that worry will never knock on the door. He tells you not to let it sit down at the table and take over the conversation. The birds still have to find food every single day. The flowers still wither eventually. Nothing about this teaching removes the real conditions of being alive in a fragile world. What it removes is the burden of believing you are the one who has to hold that world together by yourself. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying tomorrow's problems today. on top of today's problems, on top of yesterday's regrets, all at once, as if a person only has the strength for one day, but keeps trying to lift 7. Jesus seems to draw a boundary line around exactly how much weight any single day was built to carry. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. That is not a denial of trouble. It is a refusal to multiply it in advance. The flowers on that hillside did not survive the season because they figured out a brilliant strategy for survival. They survived because something outside themselves was already sustaining them before they ever bloomed. And it kept sustaining them the whole time they were growing, without their effort, without their planning, without their anxiety, contributing anything useful to the process at all. That is the kind of trust Jesus is pointing the crowd toward. Not the absence of need, but the presence of a Father who already knows what is needed before the need is ever spoken out loud. The garden sat on the slope of a hill called the Mount of Olives, just across a narrow valley from the city of Jerusalem, close enough that on a quiet night you could probably still hear faint sounds drifting up from the houses below. Families finishing their Passover meal, getting ready for sleep. It was called Gethsemane, which means the place of the oil press, because that is exactly what it was. A grove of ancient olive trees, where the fruit was crushed under heavy stone weights to release the oil inside. The olives were not damaged by being picked. They were only changed once something heavy pressed down on them until what was inside came out. Jesus had been there many times before. It was a familiar place, the kind of spot a person returns to so often that their feet almost know the path without thinking. But this night was different from every other night he had walked among those trees. He had just finished the Passover meal with his 12 closest friends, a meal during which he had taken bread, broken it, and told them this was his body, taken a cup of wine and told them this was his blood, poured out for them. He had washed their feet with his own hands, the kind of task usually reserved for the lowest servant in a household. He had told Judas plainly that he would betray him, and watched him get up from the table and walk out into the night to do exactly that. He had told Peter that before the rooster crowed, Peter would deny ever knowing him. Not once, but 3 times. And Peter had argued back that he would rather die first. By the time they reached the garden, the other disciples were heavy with wine and exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that settles into the body after a long, emotional meal late at night. Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to come further into the garden with him, the same 3 who had once seen him transfigured in glory on a mountain, light pouring out of him like the sun. Now they were about to see him in the opposite condition entirely. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. He told them, remain here and watch with me. Then he went a little further alone and fell to the ground. Luke, who trained as a physician before he became one of the writers of the Gospel, includes a detail in his account that very few people stop to actually sit with. He writes that Jesus was in such agony that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. There is a real medical condition called hematidrosis, where extreme physical and emotional distress causes the tiny blood vessels around the sweat glands to rupture, so that a person can sweat blood under the weight of overwhelming anguish. Luke had spent his life observing the human body, and he chose this detail deliberately. to describe what it looked like when a body carried more than a body was ever meant to carry alone. This is the same Jesus who calmed a storm on this lake with a single sentence. The same Jesus who stood at a tomb and called a dead man back to life after 4 days in the grave. The same Jesus who walked on the very water Peter had sunk into. And on this night, in this garden, he is on the ground, face down, sweating blood, praying the most honest words anyone in human history has ever prayed to God. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Read that again, slowly, because it is easy to read past it without letting it land. The Son of God is asking his Father if there is any other way. He is not pretending to be at peace with what is coming. He is not performing calm acceptance for an audience that is not even awake to watch him. He is alone, in the dark, asking if the cup can be taken away. And then, in the same breath, he surrenders to it anyway. This happened 3 separate times that night. Jesus prayed those words, got up, walked back to check on Peter, James, and John, and found them asleep every single time. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? He asked them, with what sounds less like anger and more like a lonely sorrow that they could not be present with him on the one night he needed it most. Then he went back, fell to the ground again, and prayed the same prayer again, word for word. There is something almost unbearably human about that repetition. It is not the prayer of a man who has already made peace with everything and is simply announcing it to God for the record. It is the prayer of a man wrestling, returning to the same plea 3 times because the weight of it had not lifted. Because surrender was not a single decision made once and then finished, but something he had to choose again and again across the longest night of his life. Everything we have walked through so far was preparing us to understand this moment, because this is where the foundation gets tested by the heaviest storm that has ever existed. And here is what I need you to see clearly. Jesus trembled. Jesus asked for another way. He did not walk into that garden with a stoic, unshaken calm that never wavered. If that is what steadfastness required, then Jesus himself would have failed the test in Gethsemane, because he was, by every visible measure, shaken to the very core of who he was. But he did not run. That is the difference. Not the absence of trembling, the decision to stay, even while trembling, even while asking God for a different outcome, even while his body was registering the kind of distress that causes blood to leave the vessels beneath the skin. He stayed on his knees in that garden instead of walking back down the hill into the city and disappearing into the crowd, which he absolutely could have done. Nobody was holding him there by force. He held himself there by something far stronger than force. There is a kind of strength our culture has trained us to admire that looks like never being afraid, never showing the cracks, walking into every hard thing with a calm face and steady hands. Gethsemane destroys that definition completely. The strongest moment in the entire story of Jesus is not a moment of composure. It is a moment of sweat and blood and 3 repeated prayers and a request to be spared, followed by a choice to stay anyway. If you have ever felt ashamed of how shaken you were in your own hardest moment, if you have ever thought that real faith should have made you calmer than you actually were, I want you to picture that garden. I want you to picture the ground stained, the 3 friends asleep a few yards away, completely unaware of what was happening just beyond where they could see. Steadfast does not mean unshaken. It means staying anyway. After the third prayer, Jesus rose from the ground. Judas was already approaching with a crowd of soldiers carrying torches and weapons. The kiss of betrayal only moments away. And when Peter pulled out a sword and cut off the ear of one of the men who came to arrest Jesus, trying to fight for him the way the world fights for the people it loves, Jesus told him to put the sword away and heal the wound Peter had just caused. He did not need to be rescued. He had already done the only thing that mattered. Hours earlier, alone, on his face, in the dark, the decision had already been made in the garden, long before the soldiers ever arrived. By the time the crowd showed up with their torches, there was nothing left to decide. He simply walked forward into what he had already surrendered to. That is what a foundation looks like when the storm finally reaches it. Not the absence of trembling, the willingness to walk forward anyway, because the decision was already settled somewhere quieter, somewhere darker, long before anyone else was watching. By the time the soldiers reached the place called Golgotha, a name that means the place of the skull, Jesus had already been awake for nearly a full day, beaten, mocked, spit on, crowned with a twisted ring of thorns pressed into his scalp, and forced to carry the heavy crossbeam through the streets of Jerusalem until his body gave out, and a stranger named Simon was pulled out of the crowd to carry it the rest of the way for him. Crucifixion was designed by the Roman Empire to be the most humiliating, slowest, most public form of execution available. Reserved for criminals, the empire wanted everyone else to be afraid of. It was meant to break a person completely, not just physically, but in spirit, so that anyone watching would understand exactly what happened to people who defied Rome. Jesus was nailed between two criminals, one on each side, exactly the kind of placement meant to tell every person passing by on the road that he was nothing more than a common thief, no different from the men beside him. The religious leaders who had pushed for his execution stood below and mocked him while he hung there. Soldiers who had nailed him to the wood gambled over his clothing within arm's reach of where he was dying. In the middle of all of that, with every reasonable justification in the world to feel nothing but rage toward the people responsible, Jesus said this, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Not after the cross was over, not years later. Once the wound had time to heal and the anger had time to fade into something more manageable, he said it while the nails were still in his hands, while the crowd below was still actively mocking him, while the people responsible for his suffering were standing close enough to hear him say it. This is the part of the story that separates the kind of strength the world admires from the kind of strength Jesus actually demonstrated. The world's version of strength says the strongest response to being wronged is to make sure the people who wronged you feel it just as badly as you did. Strength, in that version, means having the power to retaliate and using it. Jesus had every form of power available to him in that moment. He had already calmed storms, healed the blind, raised the dead. A single word from him could have brought down judgment on every person standing at the foot of that cross. Instead, he used the breath he had left to ask his Father to forgive them. One of the criminals hanging beside him, a man who had spent his life as a thief, turned toward him in the middle of his own execution and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Not a clean confession, not a polished prayer, Just a dying man, out of options, asking to be remembered by someone he had somehow recognized was different from everyone else dying around him. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. There was no test the thief had to pass first. There was no record he had to clean up before he qualified. In the middle of his own execution, Jesus was still extending mercy to the person beside him who had nothing to offer in return. Around noon, the sky over Jerusalem went dark, the kind of darkness that should not happen in the middle of the day, lasting for roughly 3 hours. And near the end of that darkness, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It is the opening line of a psalm written centuries earlier, a psalm Christians have long heard, echoing the suffering of that day, the mockery, the thirst, the feeling of being utterly abandoned. This was not despair without direction. It was a dying man reaching for words that had been written long before he was ever born, words that somehow already understood what he was living through. His final words were not a cry of defeat. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Even in the last moment, the posture was the same one he had held in the garden. Surrender, not because the pain was gone, but because the trust underneath the pain had never broken. Here is the question worth sitting with honestly. What does it actually mean to be strong when someone has genuinely wronged you? Not a small inconvenience, a real wound, inflicted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The cross says that strength is not the ability to make the people who hurt you suffer in return. Strength is the ability to hold on to who you are without letting their cruelty rewrite it. Jesus could have come off that cross a different person than he went up on it. Bitter, vengeful, hardened by what had been done to him. Every reasonable measure of human experience would have understood that response. Nobody would have blamed him. I want to say one thing clearly here, because forgiveness gets misunderstood often enough that it is worth pausing on. What Jesus did on that cross was not the same thing as staying somewhere harm keeps happening, or pretending cruelty was acceptable, or calling evil by a gentler name. Forgiveness did not require him to stay on that cross forever. It simply meant he refused to let what was done to him decide who he would become once it was over. Instead, he came through it offering forgiveness to the very people responsible, and paradise to a criminal who had nothing to give back. That is the strength the world has the hardest time recognizing, because it does not look like winning. It looks, on the surface, exactly like defeat. A man dying slowly in public, while his enemies celebrate below him. But the centuries since have not remembered the soldiers who gambled at the foot of that cross. They have not remembered the leaders who mocked him. They remember the man who hung there and forgave them anyway. Because that kind of strength does not collapse the moment it stops looking victorious. The house on the rock was never tested by easy weather. It was tested by exactly this. The worst that betrayal and cruelty and public humiliation can produce. And what remained standing on the other side of it was not a man who had been broken into someone new. It was the same love that walked into the garden the night before, now proven all the way through. On the one piece of wood the entire foundation had been preparing for. The fire on the beach was made of charcoal, and that detail matters more than it might seem at first. It was early morning, just after dawn, on the same shoreline where Peter had spent most of his life as a fisherman. The disciples had gone back to what they knew, back to the boats, back to the nets, because the last few days had broken something in them that they did not yet know how to put back together. Jesus had been crucified. Jesus had also, somehow, appeared to them alive again. But grief and confusion do not resolve themselves overnight just because the facts have changed. And Peter, more than any of the others, was carrying a weight none of the rest of them carried in quite the same way. He had denied knowing Jesus 3 times in one night, not to strangers who meant nothing to him, but inside the courtyard of the high priest, while Jesus himself was close enough to hear it. The first time, a servant girl recognized him, and he denied it. The second time, he denied it again, more firmly. The third time, he cursed and swore he did not know the man. And at that exact moment, a rooster crowed. And Luke's gospel includes one detail that is almost too painful to read slowly. Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. There was a fire that night too. Charcoal. The same kind of fire now burning on the beach in this new morning. Peter had warmed his hands beside a charcoal fire while denying Christ 3 times. And now Jesus was cooking fish over a charcoal fire on the shore Peter was about to swim toward. That detail was not an accident, and Peter would have known it the moment he smelled the smoke. He had been the one who got out of the boat to walk on water, the one who sank and was caught, the one who declared, just hours before his denial, that he would rather die than ever deny Christ. And then he denied him anyway. 3 separate times, in the exact way he swore he never would. If building on rock meant never failing, Peter had already disqualified himself completely. He had sunk again. This time, in a way, no hand seemed to reach down and catch in the moment it happened. When the disciples came ashore that morning, after a night of fishing that caught nothing, Jesus was already there, already had a fire going, already had fish cooking. He told them to cast their net one more time, and it came back so full they could barely haul it in. They ate breakfast together on the beach. The resurrected Christ and the men who had abandoned him only days earlier. After they finished eating, Jesus turned to Peter and asked him a question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs." Then he asked again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Tend my sheep." Then a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" By the third question, Peter was grieved. Scripture says it plainly. He understood exactly what was happening. 3 questions, mirroring the 3 denials, word for word, in front of the same kind of fire. This was not random repetition. This was Jesus walking Peter back through the exact number of times he had failed, not to humiliate him, but to give him a matching number of chances to declare, out loud, in front of witnesses, that love had not died in him, even though his courage had failed him that night. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep." There was no lecture, no demand that Peter explain himself before forgiveness could be given. Just 3 questions, 3 answers, and a calling handed right back to the man who had failed in the most painful way a follower of Jesus could fail. This is the part of the story I think most people get exactly backwards. We assume the man who never sinks is the strong one, and the man who fails is disqualified from ever being useful again. But Jesus had already told Peter, much earlier, on a different shore, on a different day, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Christians have understood the full weight of those words in different ways over the centuries. But in every honest reading, one thing stays true. Peter was never the foundation because he was incapable of failure. He became the kind of witness he became because he was a man capable of being restored. This matters enormously for anyone listening who has already lived through their own version of denial, a moment of fear that made them do something or say something that contradicted everything they actually believed about themselves. Maybe you walked away from your faith for a season. Maybe fear made you silent when you should have spoken. Maybe there is a version of yourself you are deeply ashamed of. A moment by a fire somewhere in your own life that you wish you could undo. The foundation was never about a perfect record. If it had been, Peter would have been disqualified before the rooster ever finished crowing. The foundation was always about what happens after the failure. Whether you run from the one who saw it happen, or whether you let him ask you the question 3 times until the answer settles all the way down into the part of you that still has work left to do. Peter went on to preach the very first sermon after the resurrection, the one that brought thousands of people to faith in a single day. Tradition holds that he was eventually crucified himself, and that he asked to be crucified upside down, believing he was not worthy to die in the same position as the Lord he had once denied. The man who sank in the water became the man who stood in front of crowds without flinching. The man who denied Christ 3 times by a charcoal fire became one of the most steadfast witnesses the early church ever had. Not because his failure never happened, because it was not the end of the story Jesus was writing with his life. If you are carrying shame over your own failures tonight, hear this clearly. Jesus does not ask you to pretend the denial never happened before. He will use you again. He asks you the same question he asked Peter, as many times as it takes for the answer to reach the places fear has touched. Do you love me? And if the answer is yes, even a shaky, uncertain, grief-filled yes, that is enough to be handed a flock to feed. Somewhere in that same region of Galilee, years after a storm, like the one that destroyed one house and left the other one standing, something happened that the original story never tells you about, but that every storm like this eventually produces if you wait long enough to see it. A family who lost everything when their house collapsed had to rebuild somewhere. They had no shelter, no walls, nothing left from what they had spent years building on ground that could not hold it. And the family whose house had survived, the one built on rock at the cost of weeks of extra digging and the mockery of neighbors who finished faster, opened their doors to the people who had lost everything. This part is not in the parable itself. Jesus was making a different point in that moment, about hearing his words and doing them. But it is the part that life itself almost always adds eventually. A foundation that holds is never just for the person who built it. Eventually, it becomes the place other people run to when their own ground gives way. Think back across everything we have walked through together. Peter, sinking into the water and being caught, then later denying Christ by a fire, and being restored by the same patient love that pulled him out of the waves. John in a dark cell, doubting in a moment he never expected to doubt, and still trusted by the one he questioned. The quiet, unseen choices that build a life in secret. Prayer behind a closed door. Forgiveness offered before bitterness has time to take root. Treasure stored somewhere thieves can never reach. The birds and the flowers, sustained without ever once striving for their own provision. Gethsemane, where the strongest person who has ever lived trembled, sweat blood, asked for another way, and stayed anyway. The cross, where strength looked nothing like winning and everything like forgiveness offered to people who had not earned it and never would. None of it was ever really about becoming a person who could not be shaken. It was about becoming the kind of person whose foundation held even while everything visible was shaking violently around it. And here is the part I do not want to leave unsaid, because it changes everything about how the rest of this applies to your own life. None of this was ever about gathering up enough willpower to copy what Jesus did. The way you might study a person you admire and try to imitate their habits one at a time. Peter did not become steadfast by trying harder after his failure. He became steadfast because the same Christ who caught him in the water was the one holding him together by the fire on that beach. And every day after, the rock was never a method. The rock was a person. The same person who is still, right now, the one actually holding up everyone who has ever built their life on him. That distinction changes everything about how this applies to you. You are not failing at faith if you feel afraid. Jesus felt afraid in that garden. You are not failing at faith if you have a moment or a season you are deeply ashamed of. Peter denied Christ by a fire and still became one of the most trusted witnesses in the early church, because Jesus asked him a question instead of writing him off. You are not failing at faith if the storm still terrifies you while it is happening. The house on the rock did not feel nothing during the flood. It simply did not fall, because what it rested on was never the strength of the people inside it in the first place. There is a particular kind of person who becomes recognizable after they have weathered something that should have destroyed them. They carry a steadiness that was not there before, not because they have stopped feeling things deeply, but because something underneath the feeling has been tested and found to hold. People in crisis are drawn to that kind of person without always knowing why. They cannot always explain it, but they can sense it. The same way you can tell just by standing near a house, whether it was built in a hurry on soft ground or built slowly on something that does not move. That is what the rock eventually becomes for the people around you, not just your own survival, shelter for someone else's storm. The question this entire story keeps circling back to is not whether the rain will come. It will. It came for the house on the sand and the house on the rock with exactly the same force. No mercy shown to one and not the other based on which family deserved it more. The only question that ever actually mattered was what had already been decided. Quietly, in private, on ordinary days, long before the clouds ever gathered on the horizon. What are you building right now, today, in the part of your life nobody else is watching? Not someday, when the crisis arrives and forces your hand. Today, while the sun is still out, while the ground is still dry, while the digging still feels unnecessary to everyone around you who finished their house in 8 days and is already hosting friends. The wise man did not build on rock because he could predict the future. He built there because he understood that the ground itself mattered more than how quickly he could finish. And because he was not building it alone. Build there, even if it takes longer. Even if nobody claps for you while you dig. Even if the only person who ever knows how deep you went before you hit solid ground is the one who was watching the whole time, and who will be standing exactly where he has always stood, hand already extended. The moment the water starts to rise, let us bring all of this to the only place it was ever meant to lead, not back into more information, but into a real conversation with the one who taught all of it. If you are willing, pray this with me now. Lord, I have spent so much time trying to build a life that looks finished on the outside, without ever asking what it is actually resting on underneath. Forgive me for the times I chose the soft ground because it was faster, because it was easier, because nobody around me seemed to notice the difference until the storm came and showed me exactly what I had built. Teach me to dig in secret. Teach me to pray behind a closed door, even when no one will ever know I was there. Teach me to forgive before bitterness has time to take root. To give without needing anyone to see it. To store up the kind of treasure that no flood and no thief can ever reach. When I am afraid, Lord, do not let me believe that fear is proof of a weak foundation. You trembled in that garden. You asked for another way, and you stayed anyway. Give me the same kind of courage, not the courage that never feels afraid, but the courage that stays even while it is shaking. When I fail you, and I will, do not let me run from you the way Peter wanted to run from himself after that fire in the courtyard. Ask me the question as many times as it takes. Do I love you? Let my answer be yes, even when it is a tired yes, even when it is an uncertain yes. And let that be enough to be trusted with something again. When someone wrongs me, give me the strength of the cross, instead of the strength the world keeps offering me, not the strength to make them suffer the way I suffered. The strength to forgive while refusing to let what they did decide who I become. Show me the difference between forgiving someone and staying somewhere the harm has never stopped. Give me the wisdom to know when love means staying, and when love means leaving, and the courage to forgive either way. And Lord, when my own house has finally weathered what it needed to weather, do not let it end there. Let it become a shelter. Let the very thing I built in private, on ordinary days no one was watching, become a place someone else can run to when their own storm finally arrives. I do not know exactly what is coming. I do not know how strong the next wind will be, or how long it will last, or what it will cost me to still be standing when it finally passes. But I know what I am building on, not the ground that is easiest to dig, not even my own strength to dig deep enough on my own. The rock that was there all along, the same rock who has already promised to hold me, the moment I go deep enough to find him, in the name of Jesus Christ, who trembled in a garden, forgave from a cross, and is still, even now, reaching out his hand to anyone willing to call out to him. Amen.